My name is John Summers, and I'm editor of the Baffler magazine, which is sponsoring this discussion tonight. The question is very simple, but also broad-ranged. What's the matter with America? And what does technology have to do with it? That's the question, or perhaps our theme. It breaks down something like this. Once upon a time, rich societies, like the United States, believed in new technology as the gateway to the true and only heaven of progress. And prognostication was, like everything else, a growth field. Tonight, Peter Thiel and David Graeber come together to discourse on the surprising disappointments and ironies surrounding the course of our new technology, and to spotlight the country's loss of faith in creating a new future fundamentally different from the present. Can anything new and different possibly come from the government and corporate bureaucracies with their stultifying organizational cultures? What role have computers played in the long stagnation of our culture? Can America survive the decline of vision among its leaders? These are some of the questions that we'll touch on, but since time is short, let's get right to the biggest question of all. Why are we here? What do a Silicon Valley investor and entrepreneur and an anarchist anthropologist know about this stuff that the rest of us don't? David Graeber.
What happened to the second half of the 20th century? That is to say, if you're growing up in, say, 1900, and you're reading H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and that kind of thing, growing up at the turn of the century, and you're imagining what the world would be like 50 years later, well, you basically got it right, you know? And there were flying machines and submarines and rockets and talking boxes and, you know, TV, radio, so forth and so on. You know, some didn't get the time machine, but a lot of the basic gamut of inventions they expected to happen did in fact happen. Now, here's me growing up in the 60s, imagining, oh my God, I'm going to be 39 years old when it's the year 2000, sort of imagining what the world is going to be like. And we all kind of knew what was going to happen too. There was a similar list of stuff. And there were going to be anti-gravity sleds and teleportation devices and Mars bases and robot androids that could like do chores for you and immortality drugs. And there's a basic standard list. And I don't think any of us expected we'd get all of that stuff within our own lives. But I don't think it occurred to any of us that we wouldn't get any of them. And the thing that fascinated me is that I know that everybody who grew up then, thought this stuff was going to happen. Well, if you were growing up at that time, it wasn't just fantasy. It was, authoritative voices. You go to the planetarium, you read National Geographic, you watch those TV science shows. Like all your elders who were supposed to know about this stuff were assuring you this is what was going to happen. That we actually believed that these things were going to happen has been wiped away as an embarrassment in our memory. It comes back to haunt us in other forms. So I wanted to break the taboo in a certain way. I remember around 2000, this is another point where this really struck home. I was waiting for all the people to talk about what we expected the world in 2000 was going to be like and how disappointed we were. Nobody said that. Everybody pretended we really were living in this world of unprecedented technological wonder. So, okay, the question for me became why. I don't think I have definitive answers, but as I began researching it, two things really jumped to the fore. And one of them was the degree to which there was a self-conscious change of direction in investment, in research and development. It was a kind of a right-wing, ruling class freak-out, which is taken up more by the right, but I think to some degree by the established left as well. That can be documented. People started saying, oh my God, what's going to happen when robots replace workers? It was a reaction to the unrest of the 60s. There were a lot of people, Alvin Toffler really embodied this in a lot of his publications, Future Shock. But it was brewing for some time before. People saying, all this unrest, imagine what it's going to be like, when the entire working class is replaced by robots, are all going to turn into hippies and dropouts. And it's going to be chaos. In that ferment, there's this idea that technological change is just happening too quickly. All this space age stuff is endangering the social order. That, the degree to which change happens quicker and quicker and quicker. So that it seemed logical that since the sort of speed at which people could travel doubles every 7 years or so, I don't remember what exactly the number was, we should be in other galaxies quite soon. In fact, the speed at which people can travel stopped exactly the year he wrote that book. And around that time, there was indeed a shift in the direction of investment, technological investment, away from all that sort of space age stuff towards investment essentially in information technology, in medical technology, and military technology. And that's where all the money's been ever since. The first thought you have is, oh, right, if they've been pouring money into that stuff, we still don't have a cure for cancer. We still don't have the immortality drugs. I mean, we've got Ritalin and Prozac and all this stuff that is useful for social control, but the really good stuff we never got even there. And even military technology, I mean, where's Klaatu? Where's the giant killer robot shooting death rays? We know they've been working on that. But even that stuff, they really haven't got, they got these model airplanes that can blow people up, whoop-de-doo. Even there, with the things they have been pouring the resources into, we never got anywhere near what we thought we were going to have. Why is that? And the conclusion I finally came to is you can only understand this in terms of bureaucracy, but not just the bureaucratization of research, because it had always been largely bureaucratized. In fact, Manhattan Project, NASA were giant bureaucracies which were incredibly productive of innovation. But it was a shift in the nature of bureaucracy that happened in the 70s and has accelerated ever since, which is essentially a corporatization, a certain type of corporatization of bureaucratization of research. It happens in universities, it happens in government, it happens in corporations themselves, which where the whole bureaucratic direction shifts away from an emphasis on production to more an orientation toward finance. Now, the old bureaucracies, I mean, whatever you want to say about them, they were big and stifling in their own ways. They actually could cultivate their eccentrics. I mean, if you look at the kind of people who were involved in the Manhattan Project, they're also almost all weirdos of one kind or another. Even the people who set up NASA, Jack Parsons, the guy who set up the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who actually made the rocket engines, was actually a Thelemite follower of a Leicester Crowley, who used to have ceremonial magic orgies in his house. This was in the 50s. Eventually, it was a lot of it apparently was organized by his wife's sister, the orgies, who then ran off with L. Ron Hubbard, causing him to become so extreme he was kicked out of NASA and became a special effects guy and eventually blew himself up. But these are the kind of people who set up NASA. You can imagine people like that being employed by government bureaucracies nowadays. I find it hard to picture. Any functional society, almost any society that's ever existed, has something to do with brilliant, imaginative, but extremely impractical people. We don't know what to do with them anymore. We just they're all living in their mother's basements saying weird things on the internet, and you can't tell which are crazy and which actually have something to contribute. You used to put them in academia, but now academia is all about self-marketing. Being in academia, I can see very easily what's happened in my own discipline, where any kind of new thinking is really discouraged. Social theory, basically what we're doing is we're writing these kind of endless annotations on French theory of the 1970s, late 60s or maybe early 80s. I call it the classic rock phenomena, They're still doing the intellectual equivalent of listening to Fleetwood Mac and Led Zeppelin and think they're cool. But this kind of endless recycling is typical of disciplines which really seem to be opposed in principle to radically new paradigms and new thinking. If you want to maximize the possibility, and I'll end with this, of unexpected breakthroughs, it's pretty obvious, what the best policy is. You get a bunch of creative people, you give them the resources they need for a certain amount of time, you maybe let them hang out with each other, but basically you leave them alone. And most of them are going to end up not coming up with anything at all, but a few of them will probably come up with something that'll even surprise themselves. If you want to minimize the possibility of unexpected breakthroughs, take those same people and then tell them they're not going to get any resources at all unless they spend the majority of their time competing with one another to prove to you they already know what they're going to create. Well, that's the system we have, and it's incredibly effective in stifling any possibility of innovation. So I'll leave off at that and see what Peter has to say.
Well, there's a disturbing amount I actually agree with David on here. I was careful to wear a suit tonight so that I wouldn't get confused with him, but I'm actually we have a tagline on our website at Founders Fund. They promised us flying cars, and all we got was 140 characters. And it's sort of, and I do think we've had this tale of two tracks in technology in the last 40 years, where there has been very rapid progress in computers, internet, the world of bits, and there's been much more limited progress in the world of atoms, flying cars, transportation, new forms of energy, new medicines, all kinds of other things that would be very transformative for our society. So strong agreement that there's something about technology that has been relatively stagnant for the last 40 years. And, I also actually agree with David, and this is harder to prove, but that there's sort of a sense of contingency that this didn't have to be this way. People say that so the most common explanation that's given is that this was a law of nature. Sort of the easiest things were discovered first, and then it became harder to discover new things. The low-hanging fruit was picked, and I think the truth is more like the fruit was never low-hanging. It was always of intermediate height, and there were various ways in which people reached for it and were able to get it, and somehow that's not happening as much anymore. And so I think things could have been quite different. And when I talk to various people in various tech and science areas, I always do get the sense that a lot more could be done. We declared war on cancer in 1970. We thought we were going to win by the bicentennial by 1976. And I think we could have made way more progress in the 44 years than we have made. 1 out of 3 people at age 85 has dementia, and we're not even thinking of declaring a war on Alzheimer's, which again is sort of an indication of how much lower our expectations for the future have been dialed down. Why did this happen? We could spend all evening debating that, and then we could get a pizza and go in the park and spend a few more months debating it, and I suspect we wouldn't actually figure out why this happened. And I want to suggest that a more important question to ask is really what should be done now. And one of in the brochure, David says, it was an excerpt from his article where he said, we're not going to get cities with domes on Mars until we change the entire economic system. And this is sort of where I think we start to disagree a little bit. I would say in order to get cities with on Mars with domes and to go to Mars, we need to just start working on going to Mars. And so one of my colleagues from PayPal, Elon, in 2002, he thought we should go to Mars. He started talking to various rocket scientists, various engineers about it. He asked, what is it feasible? What would you actually do? He organized a company. He gradually built it, and it's still a ways off, but they're working on going there. They have T-shirts that say "Occupy Mars," and so I think they probably plagiarized that. But that's sort of what I want to sort of underscore is the sense of how one goes about doing these things. We can always sort of blame the bureaucracy, we can blame all these superstructures, but I think there is a surprising amount where we can just start doing something. What does it mean to be an anarchist? It's that you start acting as though you're already free. And that's actually a sentiment I strongly agree with, and I think it should not be just free to think and free to speak or free to break things, but also free to build things, and that we are free to start building the future today. When we started PayPal, I said we weren't going to hire any lawyers for the first year because I knew they were just going to tell us we weren't allowed to do this. We just broke all the rules. The system got built, and then sort of a year later, you ask for forgiveness. You don't ask for permission, and I think something like that, is sort of a template that is working in many of these cases. The reason I have this preference for small startups instead of large mass movements is I think you have to convince a much smaller number of people. Given that we're in this culture where there's a failure of the imagination, where we no longer, have sort of a common way to talk about a wildly different future, I think the way to get out of it is by convincing a small number of people that the future can look really different. I sort of think that if we say that you should only develop these technologies if they're developed collectively by everybody simultaneously, there is a weird way in which that becomes a reason not to do anything at all. And I think that's sort of the challenge that one has with with these sort of with all these movements that have thought of changing our political system, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party. And I think a lot of the intuitions that things are broken, that we're in an era of stagnation and sclerosis, are right. But there was sort of a sense that we're not going to get to Mars by having endless debates, and I think we will get to Mars by actually working on getting to Mars. And I think there is an urgency to solving these problems. It's not if you take something like climate change seriously, or any of these sorts of issues, we need to be working on energy solutions today, and that's why I'm not willing to wait for some mass movement. I'm going to try to just convince a small number of people so we can get going right now. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Peter's suggestion that one could have or should want a cultural revolution without a social revolution to accompany it. Is that a fair description of his 10 minutes, his 15 minutes?
Well, in a way, what I thought was charming about the book is there is a call for a cultural revolution or reimagining. But I think that you're quite right in, well, again, let's look at overlap first. I think you're quite right in saying that you don't need to change people's minds first, that a large, I would go further. I'd say that you change people's minds by doing something. I mean, what we found in our efforts at direct democracy, for example, was that you're not going to be able to convince people that a democratic society would be possible. You sit there and argue, you could argue for days, you're not going to get anywhere. One reason for that is that people's everyday experience is sort of organized in such a way as to convince them that it isn't. I mean, almost nobody has any experience sitting down with any large number of people and coming to a collective decision in an egalitarian way. And so you have to do it. You just have to bring them into a situation where people do this sort of thing, and suddenly you watch 1,000 people make a decision together without a leadership structure, and it kind of works. And if you have the right process and organization going, and suddenly people say, "Wait a minute, well, I'd always assumed that was impossible. I never really thought about it, but what other impossible things might actually be possible too?" Your analysis in your book about startups being about the right size, about sort of division of labor within them, there's actually a lot of overlap. Anarchists think about affinity groups. You need to have a relatively small group. It's around the same size. You need to have informal division of labor which emphasizes complementarity. I mean, we're more into rotation and other techniques to make sure that permanent leadership structures don't arise. But in most essentials, it's quite similar. And partly, too, because we actually have to do stuff, and that's a system that has tended to work over time. I think that the real question has more to do with the larger structure. I mean, is it possible within a larger structure that seems to me to be to some degree designed to make sure that either it doesn't or that this sort of thing happens to a very limited degree? And this is one of the reasons why, actually, I think it's not something we can ignore entirely. I think the shift that happened in the 70s towards sort of within the way capitalism itself worked was away from profits largely coming from production or even commerce at all, but through finance. And finance in practice largely means other people's debts. It means various ways of rent extraction. And I like your analysis in the book. I think this is quite right, that capitalism and the market are not the same thing. That when you have pure market situations, that does tend to stifle innovation. It's not the purely desirable thing that economists say. You can't really have systematic profits under pure competition. I think I agree with that. And that in a situation where you don't have rapid technological advance, that the alternative monopolies will tend to be forms of rent extraction. And what you're trying to do is to talk about forms of monopolies that wouldn't be forms of rent extraction because they're actually based on making the pie larger. So far, so good. The question that I have is really one of cause and effect. At the moment, what we have is a large number of monopolies that are in the business of rent extraction more than anything else. There's certainly the most powerful corporations or financial institutions, that's basically what they do. Well, the question is this overall culture of stagnation. I mean, which it really is, a culture which in many ways is a direct assault on the human imagination, a product of those structures of power that those guys have created itself. I mean, I think,
Well, so there's so many different threads here.
That's
Hard to know where to
okay.
start.
I've been talking for a
I'd
while,
say,
yeah.
no, I would say that there is I agree that the eccentric university professor is a species that is going extinct fast. And we have sort of you have a Gresham's law inside these universities at work where the bad currency is driving out the good, and in effect where the people who are nimble in the art of writing for grants are displacing the idiosyncratic thinkers who are generally, one suspects, much less nimble at that sort of activity. So yes, there's a screwed up bureaucracy, and then the question is always, where should we be applying our energies? And I've been a big, like yourself, I've been a big critic of the university system. But I used to believe that the right way to do it was, all sorts of lobbying for internal change, or all these different things you should do. And I concluded that it would be much more effective just to encourage talented people to leave. And that was actually the easier thing to do. I spent a lot of time looking at it. It was one of I thought of starting a whole new university and doing everything right. Included I couldn't even do that. I looked at people. The last 100 years, people have generally had a bad history of trying to do this. And so I thought it was actually better just to get people to leave. And I think this is the issue. And I'd say yes, there are problems with all kinds of structures in our society. They probably are causing some problems, but it's not where I want to put the focus of what to change. Yes, some of these structures exist and they slow us down in different ways, but we should just start acting as though we were already free. And I think there are some things you absolutely can't do. You probably can't get a tenured position at Yale. I couldn't get a tenured position at Yale. But there are lots of other things we can do, and instead of sort of beating our head against brick walls, we should try to go down the various paths that are actually still available.
Again, speaking from the perspective of anti-authoritarian movements, this is always a big debate. To what degree can you work inside existing institutions? To what degree do you just say to hell with it and create things on the side? Or to what degree do you try to create things on the side, within the nooks and crannies of the existing institutions where they're not looking, because most of us aren't in possession of $1 billion or $2. So you kind of have to do that. The central question is, what are most people going to do? Because, and the reason, and I think most people don't understand this about Occupy Wall Street. I mean, it wasn't like the Tea Party an attempt to work through the political structure. It was exactly the opposite. We made a very determined decision quite early on that we were not going to run candidates. We were not going to enter the political process because it was hopelessly corrupt. I mean, essentially, it's a system of organized bribery and a little more. There's a small percentage of the population that's essentially profiting off this system of extraction, of rent extraction, and they've set up this perfect circular system where they essentially legislate the laws, bribe politicians to put them into place to allow them to extract more rents, and pass off the cut to the politicians. I mean, to some degree, it's all institutionalized. When a large corporation is caught doing fraud, they don't even have to plead guilty. They just sort of sign this agreement saying, okay, sorry, you got us. We're not going to admit fault, but we'll give you money. And the money's always less than they made on the fraud. So basically the government's saying, it's okay as long as we get our cut.
Look. I don't think there's that. I don't think there's quite that much intentionality. I mean, I have sort of both a less malign and more dysfunctional view of the system. I think there's no conspiracy. I think I don't think there was a conspiracy to stop scientists from actually working. I think it just sort of...
No, but people make actual decisions. I mean, it's a conspiracy implies there's a secret cabal. It's pretty public. They sit around and say, how much are we going to allocate for this? How much are we going to allocate for that?
But I think that look, the place where I think we end up disagreeing on some level is I always get the sense that what your solution always is a larger thing that somehow ultimately at the end of the day will require more structure, more bureaucracy of one sort or another. And so we're living in an advanced technological society, and so direct democracy does not actually work as a way to think about things in our society. It's too complicated. You can't vote on everything. We have a plebiscite system that you have in California is widely seen as not having worked terribly well.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're not for that. Yeah.
And probably the parts that work the best are actually the parts that are the least democratic. They're sort of there's sort of specific government agencies where people are well trained on like securities law or some esoteric area, and it's not very accountable. It's not very democratic. But that's sort of what you have to do in a complex technological society, and I think that's what's always being underestimated, either by Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party.
Okay.
Our society is too complex for everyone to get to vote on everything.
Right. Well, I mean, we're not actually for everybody plebiscite systems. Plebiscite systems tend to be actually very undemocratic in effect, and there's a reason why dictators, for example, actually love plebiscites. We're talking about very much more complicated, fundamental structural reforms and how things happen, which involve decentralization. This is something that people don't mostly understand. One of the things about anarchist models that makes them so effective is that you decentralize everything you possibly can and put it down to individual initiative.
So let me concede that there are things about that I would like politically, but I want to go back to the technology question.
Right.
Could you do the Manhattan Project? Could you do Apollo? Could you get someone to the moon in a radically decentralized, chaotic system, or do you need coordination and planning?
Decentralized. Yes, you do need coordination and planning. Frankly, I don't think that creating very large-scale but fundamentally democratic structures historically is that hard. I think it's really hard to create tiny structures that are democratic. You can get very large structures that work that way and coordinate things. What you don't get so much are egalitarian families, small-scale structures. That's what's actually much, much trickier. I think that there's a lot of things that would have to be organized very, very differently. And I understand also that you want to do some things now. And I want to emphasize here very strongly that I totally agree on that. I mean, if you can come up with an immortality drug, great, go ahead, do it.
Dictator of a small company, if I'm doing that.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I'm totally rooting for you here. If you can go to Mars,
I'm not aware of any sort of tech startup research project that was organized in this radically democratic way that really worked. I think the things that work are shockingly hierarchical in these things. They because they require leadership, they require coordination. We should be free to join other ones, and so it's good if they're small and they don't encompass our whole society. But I really don't think a startup is not. It's never. And it's really far from a democracy. People don't get to vote on things. And there've been a lot of experiments with this in Silicon Valley, where people have tried to start companies where they've been completely transparent. Normally it breaks down when they're transparent on how much everybody gets paid. It's like at about 50 people start killing each other over those sorts of things. And certainly if you try to actually make it participatory on everything, you end up with internal debate, and you don't actually get anything done. That's, and I think a lot of people would actually like to build companies like that.
Part of the problem is we grow up being told we're in a democratic society, but none of us have any experience. There's plenty of places in the world where people are sort of trained from the ground up on how to do this, and it becomes much easier. So I don't think it's absolutely impossible to create these things. But I also think, and this is a problem I think both of us have, is that it remains true that the government is the major source of most basic research. I think at the moment, I just looked it up actually before coming here, it's 56% of basic research is government funding, but only 16% is corporate. The rest of it is universities and nonprofits. So, if you put the universities and nonprofits together, not profit-oriented institutions other than government are still doing almost twice as much basic research even than corporations are at this point. So it's, the startup is a nice model for certain things. There's some amazing things that have been done, but I don't think we have to assume that's the only possible model for where the breakthroughs are going to come from, because historically it hasn't been.
I'm not saying it's the only way to do things. I'm very much in favor of it, in part because I agree there's a lot that's broken in our society, and so I think, and so that's why I think the models we have to work harder on are ones that work on a very small scale, and where you don't need to convince as many people, and where you don't need to start with as big a structural change. But yes, I mean, there are all sorts of things that I could imagine different ways they could work. I cannot imagine a straightforward way of changing these systems from within, and very hard to see how they change from without. And that's why it's like, how do we get to Mars? Do we change the NASA administration funding thing? Really hard to do, but maybe you can start a company and gradually do something like that.
Yeah, in the case of Mars, there's also a question of determination. I mean, NASA did pretty well to get to the moon. I mean, they did it surprisingly quickly considering what they had at the time. So there's nothing inherently faulty in the model. It's just there doesn't seem to be the political will. And we have to ask why that is. And we probably have somewhat different but overlapping explanations of that. All right, I agree. It would be great to have somebody working on these kind of breakthroughs, and I totally applaud the fact that people are doing it. It's also the case that I want to see a society where everybody can. And I often say that the one thing that's not a scarce resource in the world is imaginative people with possible solutions to intractable problems. There's probably nobody in the entire world that doesn't have some idea that we would never have thought of, and we're both pretty smart guys. And the problem is that the overwhelming majority of those people go around every day being told to shut up. How do you unleash that? I mean, that's my basic question, and that's why I'm interested in these broader political questions, because if one could unleash that creativity really, then I think a lot of the things we think of as problems will fall, these supposed dead ends of technological social thinking that we've hit, would seem ridiculous. I mean, there's people out there who could probably come up with cold fusion. There's people out there that could probably come up with almost anything you could imagine. Right now, they're sitting around trying to pay off their father's debt on the rice plantation and spending all their time in a shoe factory. Which is on low tech because it's more profitable to run it that way. And that's what I'm concerned of. How do we get those guys in on the game?
Well, look, I think there are all these structural things, but I think people, I do think there's always this sort of failure of the imagination. I was on a super tracked career. I was, went to it was law school. I worked at a law firm in Manhattan for 7 months and 3 days. And then when I left, people down the hall, and it was really weird psychosocial dynamic where on the outside everybody wanted to go in, and on the inside everybody wanted to leave. And people down the hall told me that it was good to see that someone could escape from Alcatraz, and it was actually all you had to do was go out the front door, and I know you'll say, well, it's harder for all sorts of different reasons, but actually no, all you had to do was go out the front door. And so I do want to always push back a little bit on how powerless people really are, and I'm annoyed by that people are not more creative, that they're not doing more in all sorts of contexts, but I think there are actually a lot of ways to do things, and that's surely that's where we have to start, since you're not going to start by we're not going to start by changing the bureaucracy at NASA or at Yale University or anything like that.
Both been very polite. Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, I actually respect
yes,
you do want to see immortality drugs. It's, well, what's to invest in that? Great. I want to live forever.
Is there a way in which, or any ways in which your respective positions are working against each other?
Oh, yeah.
Do you have political objectives that are separate from the utopian political or the utopian technological universe that you'd like to see?
I don't believe that these political institutions can be changed. I don't think this is what one should do. I used to believe this a great deal. You know, if you held a gun to my head and said, you know, what are your political views on things, I'd say that I'm sort of libertarian, and this is sort of socially more liberal, fiscally more conservative, or something like that. But you know, temperamentally, I would describe myself much more as a political atheist. I do not believe that the existing political order is divinely ordained or sacred or special, and I don't believe there's any other order that could replace it that would deserve that sort of deference. And I find myself just not believing in it.
Right. I mean, which is why it's funny that we're seeing this as a debate, because, you know, I've been part of a movement whose basic premise was we are not going to work through the political system. I mean, one thing I find in some of this stuff I've been doing economically about money and different ways of thinking about money, moving past the sort of dead-end neoliberal discourse about currency, is that the political class is just useless. There's no point in talking to those guys. They're basically bought and sold. They're totally locked into a certain logic, whereas you know, even the technocrats, the guys who are kind of running the system, you know, they know the thing is broken, and they've got to actually put in place these policies these idiots come up with. I mean, they know they're based on entirely false premises. There's a huge break right now between the Bank of England and the entire political class in England, where the Bank of England has said, well, actually, you know, it's not like there's really a lack of money. You know, money is created by making loans. Everything they say is wrong. We admit that now. The heterodox economists were right. Political class keeps carrying on as if this isn't the case. So yeah, the political system itself is useless. The question
So I'll disagree with
What?
the money part here.
Yeah.
So I feel like you should disagree with something
Okay,
a little
sure,
bit.
there we go.
So, you know, we can have all sorts of debates about distribution or about things like this, but I actually do think that that there is such a thing as an economy, that there is such a thing as scarcity, that there's not enough necessarily to go around, and that therefore you have this very complicated way of allocating things. And even though it is true that we can, in theory, print infinite amounts of money, that's not a way of solving the problem of scarcity. And I think actually by shifting the problem to the level of money, you're making the same kind of shift from atoms to bits that you questioned earlier on, where, you know, think of money as the perfect virtual good, but what it stands for are always real goods, and so when you print more money, you don't actually change the underlying nature of the real goods, and I think that's something that I'd be much more focused on. The reason I think the technological stagnation is a problem is because of this problem of scarcity, and I think we need to, you have 7 billion people in the world, 6 billion people live in emerging market nations, and if they're going to have living standards anything like the ones that people in the developed world enjoy, you need all sorts of new technologies to enable that to happen. And the reality is that we have, we have a certain amount of scarcity. Economics was the science of how to economize, in some ways, and I think in some ways we shouldn't turn it into the science of how not to economize.
Oh, I'm not saying that people should just print money. I'm actually saying we should acknowledge how money actually works, which is just not the way the politicians say. This is a long conversation, but I think that what we can say is that there are certain types of economic policy which would unleash popular creativity, which is the other factor, because money isn't just measuring the value of stuff. It's also measuring the value of human actions, and it's also a promise of future creativity. And that's the thing. What are the forms of money creation or economics in general that will do that. Again, going back to the question of all those people with the ideas who basically are told to shut up all the time. Some people often criticize me, for example, for sometimes putting in a good word for basic income, which is actually something that there are certain elements of the left and the right can support. I think of it as partly as an anti-bureaucratic thing, that actually reduce the size of government and not have all these bureaucrats looking over everybody's shoulder, telling them, like, making them feel bad about themselves all the time. If you simply gave people a basic income support, it would mean that you're trusting them to decide how they want to contribute to society. Ironically, a lot of the social welfare policies, which you think of as stifling, were also, actually unleashed creativity in ways that we only know now that they're gone. I live in England. It used to be, since the 60s at least, every 5 years there'd be some amazing new band or musical trend that would just sweep the world coming out of England. And that's all kind of stopped since Tony Blair, really. And I asked people there, well, what happened, And everybody says the same thing. They got rid of the dole. All those guys were on unemployment. And they were squatting too, so they got rid of squatting. It used to be there'd be free housing, and you'd have a base. It wouldn't be much, but you'd have enough money that you could get your friends together with a guitar, and maybe 1 out of 1,000 of them was John Lennon, but that's enough, And now John Lennon is lifting boxes in some department store as welfare conditionality. We're never going to hear the new trend. So I just think that that techniques which just leave it up to people on the broad scale to innovate in their own ways would actually be much more effective in creating the conditions where all these things both of us want to see would happen. And that's why I'm interested in those broader questions, because at the moment, I think the system we have is very much about tying people down. Again, the debt situation, this is not something that just happened. This happened because of very calculated decisions. And you could see it very much, again, in the UK, where they did an tuition reform where they said, okay, let's just raise tuition across the country and give everybody student loans and then we'll be in debt. It's completely self-conscious. This is not just something that just happened somehow. But the point of that is to make sure that people start thinking of education not as a sort of exploring whatever they think might be interested in deciding for themselves where they can put their creativity, but rather, do something which people who want to hire them in the relative immediate future will definitely want now.
So look, I think the student debt is a huge problem. Certainly I would ascribe a lot of the problem to the runaway cost structures universities have. So that's as much a problem as it is
in America.
The interest compounding, and I do think I think the intentionality, there's not that much intentionality in the system. It's just there's not
in England
enough.
It was a policy. They just said, okay, let's create student debt.
Well, I think there was a sense that there was some degree of scarcity on these things. You always have, there is this problem of scarcity that, and this is why I think it's, we shouldn't obscure that. Now you can say there are distributional questions, and maybe other people should have paid for it or something, but
that's why those larger questions, I don't think they can be ignored. And I think the final thing I would say is that you can't really be a political agnostic in some sense. It's understandable that one wants to work within the system that exists, but insofar as one does not end up self-consciously opposing that system in some way, or calculating a way to at least act in a way that will not reinforce it, one tends to act in ways that do reinforce it and actually often make the problem worse. What we have, it seems to me, since the 70s, and this has corresponded to this technological stagnation, has been an increasing emphasis on the fusion of government power and financial power in a system of rent extraction. And again, maybe nobody sat down and planned it, although they certainly talk things out with each other at the G8s and so forth. And there is a degree of self-conscious, at least guidance of the direction of the whole thing. But lobbyists are essentially conspiring. That's what they do for a living. They just do it publicly and officially. That has sort of locked in a structure which is inherently inimical to innovation. And one can operate within that, and and it's great that there are pockets of people within the system who are going to try to turn it against itself. But you're essentially pushing against a tide here.
Well, it's again, we're sort of cycling on this nonstop, but I always keep coming back to this is not the most constructive thing to be working on. I think the more constructive things are to figure out ways to do new things, and this is why I think even with all the excess hype in Silicon Valley that's a little bit off, even with the ways in which I'd like innovation, not just in bits but also in atoms, and there is some sense in which the financial era is over, that it sort of has hit a wall, and it's going to be this long deflationary period. They got a huge bailout in 08, 09, but the bonuses are slowly getting cut back, and the banks are slowly going to get shrunk and delevered. I think at this point it has shifted to Silicon Valley in a very powerful way, and I think this is actually a very hopeful development, because I think this is. People have actually figured out this is where you can make a difference. This is where you can actually change things.
Well, it's an interesting argument. I mean,
well, it's a description of what's going on.
In terms of the larger numbers, though, I mean, in terms of where the profits are coming from, it's still largely in the financial sector. I would
argue, it's you have to think all this. It's always about the future. Where do people think they will come from in the future? Where do people think careers will be made in the future? Where do they think they will have an opportunity to impact the world in the future? And there is a way in which Google has really displaced Goldman Sachs in a and again, you can say you don't like Google or something, but it is there is a way in which we've had this enormous shift to Silicon Valley. There are problems in Silicon Valley. I think we're not doing enough. I'm always of the but I think it is the place that is most about trying to do new things.
Certainly, that's true.
That is most about trying to create new forms in our society, and so that is a very hopeful trend.
Well, I guess the question, I mean, and you wanted something adversarial, so I'll throw this out. I guess the question is got to be, is Silicon Valley actually posing an alternative to that larger structure where you have a fusion of financial and sort of security?
No, not really. But I don't think. But I would argue that's again, this is my political atheism, or maybe it's just I'm secretly working on behalf of the regime here, or something like this. But that is. But I think the way that you the thought is we're not going to change the structures. We're not going to change those things, and we will work on these on other things. You have companies like Airbnb, and sort of they're changing some of the urban regulations. Things like this do shift, and the education system is going to probably shift at some point with online courses, and so a lot of these things look like they're too small initially, but I do think they can grow into things that will really change our society. And this is always why as a libertarian I find myself working in technology rather than politics, because in politics I find you have to convince too many people, and I can never convince enough people to agree with me. It's too hard.
We'll see about that tonight. But you said you're maybe secretly working for the regime, but can you speak about Palantir?
Yeah, that's where I was going.
It's really not so secret. It's not really very secret, is it? I mean, you're working with the CIA and the and correct me if I'm wrong, but the U.S. Army and on
J.P. Morgan Chase.
J.P. Morgan, and I mean, your political agnosticism hasn't prevented you from.
Right, and that's where I was actually sort of going with this. Is it's one thing to say, okay, we're doing something else, but we're not trying to challenge the structure. But there's another thing, sort of using those technologies to actively reinforce the very structure, which is ultimately stifling creativity.
No, look, I think there are all sorts of concrete problems that we need to solve. SpaceX is working with. It works with the U.S. military to help get financing to launch satellites, and on the Palantir side, I do think that there is, I do think there were some very big buildings that were blown up here in New York City, and as a libertarian, I don't think we should have had the response we did to those buildings blowing up. But you did, all the mass movements, all the consciousness raising in the world did not stop us from getting the Patriot Act. The ACLU is always good at talking about civil rights. Once something bad happens, you never get, the protections go out the window right away. And so I actually do think that there's something to be said for trying to figure out some ways to stop another attack which will be used to curtail civil liberties a lot more. A company like PayPal could not get started in the post-Patriot Act world because we would have been accused of money laundering in '99 to 2000. And so I do think the fact there was no technology to stop terrorism in 2001 is what has led to a far less libertarian world.
Another reason.
Yeah, that's my understanding of it.
Right. I mean, another reason why 2001 happened is because all the intelligence resources were being brought to bear disproportionately on people like me and my friends, rather than the guys who are actually going to blow something up.
Look, if Snowden has revealed anything about the NSA, it is how little technology there is, how incompetent it is. So if you have an intelligence agency where someone is downloading all the files, and it doesn't raise any suspicions whatsoever. I mean, this is much more like the Keystone Cops than Big Brother, and so we've had a world where there's been not very much privacy, but not very much security either. And I think that, and I think we could try to have more of both.
Is Palantir moving from Keystone Cops to Orwellian? Is that the
No,
idea?
we get Orwellian because of the Keystone Cops, because they know they're incompetent. They have to always do more and more. So you just have to hoover up all the data in the whole world because you have no idea what you're doing.
Let's stop this portion of the program. Thank you very much. Davey and Peter. We'll take some questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask both of you, since you're in such great agreement to begin with. I feel like what the larger phenomenon you're describing is both a breakdown in creativity and the imagination, but also a failure to commit basic resources to research and development. And what you're describing historically actually, I guess for you specifically, David, when you talk about, how all the reveries of the early 20th century gradually came to pass, there's a very specific way that all came to pass, and it has to do with forces that I don't think either of you like, which are government and ideology and the Cold War. These were far and away the drivers for the basic infrastructure of the computer revolution, as you say, military technology, things that, but more than that, things that actually succeed and that we use on a daily basis, like interstate highway system, the GI Bill back when education sort of seemed to work. And all these forces were knitted together by an ideology, and it's an ideology that had lots, in drawing attention to this, I feel like John McCain or Bob Dole or something, like you ingrates, you don't understand the sacrifices that were made. But in fact, there's something to that. You're both, I think, have certain utopian affinities where you think devolve, decentralize, persuade smaller groups of people. But, it's a big economy, it's a big society. To get change that registers meaningfully, there needs to be a shared commitment of resources, and it's hard for me to see from either of your visions how that occurs.
I always like the line that the Apollo moon landing was the greatest historical achievement of Soviet communism. They never would have done it if it hadn't been for the Russians. That's true. And the Soviet Union was actually, I'd only learned about this fairly recently, had all sorts of crazy, insane, huge ideas. They had to cancel and it collapsed. They were going to shoot hundreds of solar-powered satellites into space to beam energy down to Earth. And, you know, those guys actually did think big, and they came out of a tradition of thinking big, and they did so in ways that were insane and disastrous. But they also did so in you know, ways that were kind of interesting. Most of them didn't work, but nonetheless, they had that impulse. And in a way, there was just an imitation of that. The moment the Soviet threat died, they said, okay, hell with that stuff. And, you know, sort of went on to technologies of social control, ironically enough. But nonetheless, I think that the answer to the question is, I am not actually saying that small anarchist affinity groups are the only, you know, organization that could possibly work. I mean, I don't believe in national purpose because I don't really believe in nations. I don't think nation states are a particularly good unit of organization for doing large projects, but I'm not against large projects. I mean, some things like a space program is going to have to be done on a really big scale by a bunch of people who are united by a vision. I mean, what I look forward to is a social order where people are sufficiently guaranteed, you know, are sufficiently secure in their basic needs that they can sort of affiliate with each other around those things which they think are of larger value, you know? And those things could be anything from, you know, the fact that they're like chess obsessives to like some religion to the fact that they want to go to Mars. And I think there's a sufficient number of people on Earth who would, if given that like life security, organize themselves together because they want to go to Mars, and you know they could like wrangle enough resources to do it. But I mean, it's that principle of freedom. But you have to guarantee that people aren't, you know, debt slaves, and they aren't running around desperately trying to like survive before you're going to be, you know, they're going to be free to form those voluntary associations on that scale to do that kind of thing.
You know, just to, again, there's always this question: how much is it these structures? How much is it all these things in our society? You know, so I think there's like this interesting question that's been raised, like what went wrong in the '70s? Since we both agree this is the decade when things seem to break. So I'll give a non-structural explanation for what went wrong in the 1970s. The U.S. ran out of oil. So it's, you know, the early warning sign was in 1970 when the Texas Railroad Commission, which was able to set global oil prices by giving quotas on how much oil people can ship on Texas railroads. It was the OPEC of the 50s and 60s. I think it was 1971, it announced there was no quota anymore. And then within 2 years, you had an oil shock. And then we had all kinds of crazy financial manipulations, and we had a series of oil shocks in the 70s. And the basic non-structural explanation, if I had to give a single causal one, would be we haven't recovered from the oil shocks of the 70s, and there was a way in which a cornucopian economy in which there were one of the most fundamental resources, namely energy, was unlimited in the 50s and 60s, all of a sudden became limited, and that changed, you know, all these dynamics in really powerful ways.
But taking the technology question, I mean, why didn't we come up with something else? I mean,
well, but nothing actually changed structurally. It was just
right.
It was just you had this shock, and people we should have worked on it harder. We should still be working on it harder. And you have questions why that didn't happen. But
yeah, because I mean, like, it's as an explanation for what went wrong in the 70s. I mean, is the question that we ran out of oil, or that for the first time when we started running out of something, we no longer had the structures that could create an innovation that would create an alternative to it quickly enough?
Certainly, again, my cut on this would be that you'd have very important questions why nuclear power got shut down in the 70s at the same time, which I think was much more something the left shut down than the right. And this was seen as the default post-carbon fuel. Maybe it was too dangerous. Maybe it was always weaponizable.
Tell people in Japan, yeah.
Well, if you believe climate change is the most serious problem in the world, that what happened in Japan seems like not that big a deal relative to the consequences that people tell us will happen from climate change. So I always do think. And of course, one of the reasons it happened in Japan was we haven't modernized the plants in 50 or 60 years.
Every advance in technology has also proven a weapon against you. Every single one, from stem cells, atomic energy, the immune system, it's already projected to be weaponized. So that's a natural dialectic in all this wonderful invention. It isn't just a systems analysis. And the other problem, which was discovered fairly recently, but also has its long history, but also did that retardation thing that you seem to think is only a systems problem. We discovered that every time we create more technology, we create a pollution stream that actually becomes its own negative force. Now, I wanted to say one thing about this Mars. It's been built all night long. Just to give you a personal note, my brother actually wrote the algorithm that allowed the Mars exploration, so I've been very, very close to NASA, love it. But I noticed something about the fascination with Mars. How many people do you think will go there out of the 7 or 20 billion people who will be left on a polluted world? And what kind of nature will they find there that they cannot destroy? That's my question.
On that cheery note.
I'll take that up. I'll take that up. Wait a minute. I think that's important because I think that you know that sort of logic, it's superficially hard to argue with, but it's anything you come up with can be weaponized. But everything that already exists can be weaponized too. That's not really a reason not to change anything. Any social change might actually be used to hurt people or result in hurting people. I mean, what it sounds like is you're giving a prescription of utter conservatism in everything in a society which is really radically imperfect. I'm just saying that what you present to me doesn't seem very dialectical. It just seems to be saying that everything has its downside. Yeah, everything can be weaponized. Yeah, everything's going to create pollution. But I mean, I think that this is my all right. One of the more compelling things that I've read about nature and technology was by a physicist named Smolin. It made a great impression on me. Saying, well, we have this, people think there's a technological fix to everything and they're crazy. And there's also people just say well, let's leave nature alone, everything will be fine, we just need, technology is bad. And this opposition between technology and nature is itself a construct which doesn't make a lot of sense. And lies at the basis of a lot of those prescriptions. You say, all right, well, global warming is obviously man-made. Skeptics say, no, it isn't. It just happens naturally. Every now and then the planet heats up, it cools down. That is true, but that's not what's happening now. Everybody with any common sense knows that. But he pointed out, on the other hand, say we actually do get through this and survive, we are going to hit a point where the planet does heat up or cool down naturally if you given enough time, and it's going to be just as destructive and devastating as if it happened, because we made it. And we're going to have to actually come up with a technological solution to keep ourselves alive. In that case, by intervening in nature. Nature isn't all that great, not all the time. I mean, it could shrug us off all of its own accord.
I don't think either of us is sort of Panglossian about technology as the simple cure for all of our problems. I have more sort of this negative intuition, which is that without technology, none of these problems will get cured. And so, and that's something I have a very strong view on.
I'd agree with you strongly on that too.
And then there are sort of a lot of things, and then it's still, you have all these questions: is it good? Is it bad technology? Does it get weaponized or not? Or how does it get used? Those are real questions people should need to figure out. But I think with 7 billion people on this planet, we can't go back to some sort of Neolithic past which worked with 10 million. You can't go back. We've gone too far, and we have to go further.
We have gone too far, that's right. Peter, David, thank you very much.